Our first speaker will be Dr. Grace Lemon. She's an associate professor of management at DePaul's Management and Entrepreneurship Department. She received her PhD in business administration from University of Illinois at Chicago. She teaches a variety of classes on leadership, organizational psychology, and stress management, a very timely topic during this age of COVID. She's also the director of our wonderful DBA, Doctorate in Business Administration program. I've taught in that program, and I know firsthand that Dr. Lemon does a fantastic job. Our second speaker will be Dr. Joseph Mello. Joe Mello is an associate professor of political science here at DePaul. He's a relatively recently minted PhD, getting his PhD in 2012 from the University of Connecticut. And he received tenure here in 2019. Congratulations on that, Joseph. That was great news. He works on the relationship of law and society, the intersection of those two. He's especially interested in how social movement activists use the law to bring about or resist social change. His first book, The Courts, Ballot Box and Gay Rights, was published by KU, University of Press, Kansas, in 2016. And he has another book that's just gone under contract at Stanford that will be on pot for profit. And as we'll see, his research presentation today has a lot to do with pot. So that's it for introductions. I now turn the microphone over to Grace Lemon. So I think, Summer, you can make that happen. Thank you.
All right, Summer, can you give me a yes if I'm sharing? Awesome. All right, thank you all of you for taking some time this afternoon to listen to me talk about a topic I feel a great passion about. I'm going to be talking today about weight-based mistreatment at work. So this idea that people in larger bodies may be bullied because of their size in the workplace. This research would not be possible without the really gracious support of the Institute for Business and Professional Ethics and, of course, the fellowship. I hope you guys know how much your time and money really do help research get done. So it is somewhat of an interesting topic, I think, and so I wanted to tell you how I came to study this somewhat micro concept of weight-based mistreatment at work. When I received tenure, I decided that I wanted to make the most of it and completely switch the focus of what I was researching and narrow in on something I felt more personal passion about. And I've always been curious about how body image, how you think about your physical presence, impacts how others treat you in the workplace. And I was very fortunate that I found a colleague at DePaul, Jacqueline Jensen, who studies incivility at work, and another colleague, Goran Kulinin, who does exploratory analytics, to kind of team together with to explore this new construct. And so really the work I'm presenting here today is not simply my intellectual property, but we are definitely a team working on this together. So today I'm going to establish for you what weight-based mistreatment is, how you might conceptualize this construct, and central to this fellowship, I want to try to describe what goes on in the mind of a bully, of a perpetrator, of somebody who is making those off-color remarks to somebody who's in a larger body at work. And specifically, I'll dig into what ethical rationales we found that these perpetrators use when deciding to act on kind of negative impulses they have toward larger bodied colleagues. So to do that, usually in my field, it's very common to go through what we know theoretically about a construct. And so when we think about the idea of size and somebody's physical size and presence at work, we can look to the great body of literature in psychology on stigma to start to understand what that experience might be like. So when somebody is stigmatized, they have certain assumptions or associations levied upon them because of an attribute. And so stigmatization can occur very commonly because of somebody's ethnicity or gender or age or sexuality. And of course, in this context, we're talking about associations and assumptions made about somebody because of their physical size. And there is a fairly robust body of literature that shows how we make automatic assumptions that larger bodied individuals are assumed to be unmotivated, sloppy, lazy, they're more selfish in social interactions, less competent, and so forth. And it's actually rather tragic that the stigmatization process is increasing over time. There have been really interesting studies about how stigma toward certain attributes, like being of the Muslim faith or being part of the LGBTQ community or being of darker skin, how bias over time has gone down. Despite some recent events, it has gone down, but not for weight. In the past decade, we've seen great increases in rates of stigmatization toward those in larger bodies. And in the workplace, the stigmatization really comes out economically. People in larger bodies, through these studies of discrimination, we've seen those in larger bodies are not offered jobs at the same clip, at the same rate, despite having equal qualifications as somebody in a quote normal size body. People in larger bodies aren't offered as frequent promotions, are kind of downgraded on performance evaluations. And so there's a real economic cost to being in a larger body at work. We also know that more meta in our culture, in talking about US culture and Western culture in particular, we have some pretty negative attitudes toward those in larger bodies. And I won't detail what all of those attitudes are, but the two dominant ones we find are, number one, if you're in a larger body, it's bad and you bear 100% responsibility for that badness. If you're in a larger body, you just need to move differently, eat differently, take care of yourself differently. And if you did these things, you would be in a quote normal body. It's actually unsurprising that this misstated truth is so pervasive. There's actually a lot of research that says that your size, your physical size, is determined by your genetics, by your upbringing, by your socioeconomic class when you are a young person. And so the element of choice that we often perceive for somebody being in a larger body is actually not present when we look at the evidence. And I will say that even if we look at dieting behaviors, people trying to reduce their size by reducing eating, there's zero long-term studies that show 5+ years out that dieting has efficacy. The most common thing associated with dieting is weight gain, not weight loss. Another cultural attitude, not very much rooted in fact, is this attitude that people in larger bodies deserve shame. And it's very common for us to levy shame against those in larger bodies. If you ever see characters on TV shows in larger bodies, they're oftentimes made fun of. They're the butt of the joke. That's the first thing you learn about this person. And there's a level of permissiveness around shaming that is rather troubling. And again, the evidence says that shaming does nothing. You cannot shame somebody into a smaller size body. In fact, it's quite the opposite. Huge amount of research shows that when you shame somebody, depression, anxiety, self-esteem, they all, go for the worse. And as a result, people are less likely to move, make fruitful food choices, and do the things that promote health in their body. So really the opposite impact. So with that in mind, my research team and I looked at among those people occupying a larger body, and we let people self-identify being in a larger body. We found that the kind of BMI range of people reporting a larger body, you might, if you're kind of in a female body, or you understand female sizes, like just over plus size, and then a little bit higher, all the way up to people who are much larger than what we consider quote unquote normal. So people who self-identify as being in a larger body, 89% of them, so nearly 9 in 10 of these individuals report that in work, this place of professionalism, allegedly, maturity, allegedly, they are experiencing mistreatment because of their size, nearly 9 in 10. And not only that, 75% of those individuals experience that within the past 6 months. So it's a relatively frequent occurrence. We found that the type of mistreatment that these larger bodied people experience is not just one category. Most of our sample, it was around 2,000 people, experienced a range of aggressions. So people swearing and insulting them because of their size, withholding critical resources, or just saying, we call it an insult wrapped into a compliment. Like you sit down next to a larger bodied person at work and say, have you ever, thought about eating a salad for lunch? And so there's some ambiguity around intentionality, but it's kind of a jerk thing to say, and also none of your business. We call that benevolent mistreatment. So most of the sample received multiple types of mistreatment, and it was coming from everybody. So it's not just coming from subordinates or even coworkers, people with less power. We found that people who were mistreated came from their bosses. It came from customers. There really was no boundary when it came to this weight-based mistreatment. We also wanted to look at well-being of those who were mistreated. Performance suffered. So you experience mistreatment at work, you ruminate about it excessively, you put less effort into your work, you work fewer hours, you don't want to help others as much, you probably want to rebalance that kind of social dynamic by not helping others. Your professional confidence plummets. You feel as though your reputation has suffered, you don't use your voice at work, you don't express yourself, you don't lean into challenging work. And I think most tragically, these people who experienced this mistreatment, they had severe repercussions for their well-being. They didn't know how to cope. They didn't report any increase in self-care. The only thing that they really reported a lot of is kind of poor treatment of themselves. So more use of drugs, more use of alcohol, suicidal ideation, disordered physical and eating behaviors. And so these people who are the victims of weight-based mistreatment are truly suffering. Last thing on this topic before we get into the ethics of the perpetrator, and I'm showing this slide because I think it does start to get into the head about what types of contexts somebody who predates these victims might feel supported in, like they feel more comfortable shaming somebody in a larger body. So climate, this graph right here shows in our sample, some of our sample, a small part of our sample, had not been mistreated because of their size. The other part had. And so for those who had been mistreated, they're much more likely to work in a climate that they consider less inclusive, not just about weight, but about kind of demographic attributes at large. Not only that, those who are more likely to be mistreated are working in a workplace environment where we call it fat talk is very common, where people commonly talk about, oh, I feel so gross, I eat too much, I'm so fat. Like it's just kind of part of the discourse. It's like talking about the weather, much more common when people, in contexts where people are mistreated. And there's some subtle pressure, workplace pressure to be thinner, to lose weight, to conform to some ideal. In those types of environments, weight-based mistreatment is more common. Okay, so we know that this is a serious problem afflicting most people in larger bodies. And so we want to start to unravel why it's happening so commonly. And so my team decided to try to get into the head of the perpetrator. If we know what motivates them, we might be able to somehow discourage or educate them in kind of ways that would make them feel second guess making some of those comments and enacting those behaviors. So the results I'm presenting are preliminary. We had to, like most of the world, stop collecting data at a certain point because of COVID-19. We were collecting data from people who are physically co-working with coworkers, Zoom. You only know what I look like from here up. So people can disguise their size a little bit more in a virtual environment. And we don't want that. We want to collect data from environments where it's very obvious what people's sizes are. So this is just a data with 300 preliminary responses, still a decent sample size, but that's where we're at. We wanted to look at what sort of ethical justification was made on the part of the perpetrator to translate this impulse, this like thought they have, this stereotype they have about a larger bodied person, colleague at work, and actually saying something or doing something aloud. We found some interesting research also that people who have their own kind of weight issues, like they've either struggled with weight loss or they themselves have lost weight very easily or recently, are much likely to be less generous toward those in larger bodies. People in socially dominant groups, which we can certainly say if you're in a quote normal or average size body, you're in a dominant group, a privileged group. We see sometimes socially dominant groups feel comfortable looking down on those in quote unquote lesser groups or those with less social power. And so we're going to talk about that now. Our survey design, we thought it's somewhat clever, we think. We asked these MTurk workers, happy to answer questions about the workers, but just know we put in a massive amount of quality checks. So we have pretty high confidence in this data. We asked them first, have you had a negative thought about a coworker's weight within the past 6 months? So have you thought about a coworker's weight? And they said yes or no. If they said no, they weren't part of our study at all. If they said yes, it appeared up here in my head. We asked them the second question. Did you act on that thought? Was there a behavior that followed that line of thinking? We were thinking like, oh, people are not going to admit to this. They're not going to actually act on these kind of negative impulses in their brain. And when we were wrong, 92% of our sample stated that they had a negative thought about a coworker's larger body and acted on it within the past 6 months, which perhaps should not be surprising given the rate of mistreatment that we saw, but it was still relatively astounding to us. And there was no incentive for them to say yes or no. This was anonymous. They didn't get paid more. This was a true blue answer. The perpetrators were kind of the typical worker. So if you compared their attributes to those figures at the Bureau of Labor Statistics, about the same age, about the same salary, a little more white than usual, a little bit more junior in their career. This is what you want to see, I think, if you are of the ethics mindset. This is kind of the crux of our study. We went through a bunch of ethical justifications that a perpetrator may use to motivate translating a thought into deed. So the deontological perspective, when you make a decision to act based upon an obligation, duty, or promise, you're remarking on a colleague's weight, their size, because you have a duty to, say, protect society from the cost of obesity, like healthcare costs. We looked at the utilitarian perspective, the idea that you make a choice to act based upon what will provide the greatest good or not to act. So this could be the perpetrator weighing, I could remark on somebody's weight, it might hurt their feelings. And is that providing greater good than just not saying anything and, letting society have another larger person be on the docket on their medical bill, for example. So weighing those two options. Justice perspective, that the ends justify the means, that if I remark on my colleague's weight and the end result is they're like, that is true, I am fat, I am going to work out more. Although that's not evidence-based, the perpetrator can create those logical leaps and they decide to make a comment about somebody's size. They think that the end, person losing weight, justifies the harshness of the comment. Right to free speech. Some people act because they think they have this God-given, constitution-given, whatever your deity is given right to express their opinion. And, I don't like big people. And so if I see someone at work, I'm going to go ahead and call that out. I have a right to express my opinion. There's the ethics of care. This is when you decide to act because you want to communicate caring toward another person. And you also have, in this instance, somebody remarking on somebody's weight because you care for their health. So you say, okay, Jan, I noticed you're a little bigger. I care about you. I don't want you to be sick. So despite that not being an evidence-based perspective, I'm going to suggest a diet to you. And then there's virtual, this idea that in society we have these virtuous standards that to be American, we have to be mentally and physically fit, sound of mind and body. And when somebody doesn't conform to these standards, it's worth being called out. So we did a comparison. We walked through these different justifications with our self-professed perpetrators, people who had no qualms about saying, yep, I mistreated somebody because of their size. And we found that the two justifications that were most common were the ones, ends justify the means, that, yeah, it's going to sting, but this person needs to hear it. And I have a right to express my opinion. Those are the two most common. The least common one was the one about caring, that I really care for this person. And so I really feel like I should act to express that level of caring. My conclusion here is that there's no benevolence. The two most commonly associated reasons that somebody acted are based on individual needs and individual rights and somebody's feelings and group needs and creating a positive, inclusive culture. Be damned. I want to say something, so I'm going to say it. Maybe feels a little bit like our current political situation. There's some sort of weird parallel going on here. I also found this pattern where I think that the perpetrator is, they're assuming so much about the victim's state of health when they really don't know anything about it. They don't know what that person's medical records say. They don't know what that person's last doctor's visit said. And so it doesn't matter. They're still feeling like I have the right to make these comments, so I'm going to do so. So a little bit more on this. I know I'm running a little close. I'll give 2 more minutes. When we look at these different frames, I tried to kind of bundle the ethics frames together, which I could be committing a major faux pas to those ethics researchers. My apologies. But bundling those frames that have to do with duty, like I have a duty to protect someone, versus dominate. I want to project myself onto this person, versus derision. Like I just don't like that and I don't want to see that. The ethical frames of dominance were most common, and we found that our perpetrators felt that they had the attitude that people who are larger deserved less attention, fewer resources, less pay, were less valuable workers, didn't have willpower, shouldn't receive opportunities at work. And so there's this real sense of you are lesser and you deserve lesser. And so what does it matter if I'm rude or uncivil or worse to you? One final note here, we also found a very strong correlation between this personality trait of social dominance, this idea that somebody believes that they are superior to others, that some groups in society are just better off, that some people are just inferior, that some people simply deserve less, that inequality is okay and natural. And that's what, evolution has taught us. This was very strongly correlated with rate and strength of mistreatment above our sample, this personality trait. And so I'm calling it, how I see it, it's hate. Okay, this idea that there's inequality and you can step on people because they're unequal, that's hate. And so I feel like that's what's burbling up in this research. Some takeaways. Number one, weight-based mistreatment is a huge issue that is normalized and should not be. We need to have a moment where, like we did with homophobia, when somebody said, that's so gay, maybe 15 years ago, you can say that. Now it's extremely off color. We need a moment like that for weight-based mistreatment. We need to include in these really robust diversity, equity, and inclusion conversations this idea that weight is a diverse attribute and is deserving of as much sensitivity and protection as some of these other attributes that we really protect. And that finally, we need to call it out. When we see this type of predation at work, stop normalizing it, start portraying a counter narrative about weight at work, speak up if you say something. Okay. That was a lot, but I'm going to turn it over to Summer and Daryl to answer any questions you have.
Great, thank you. Would you mind unsharing your screen for me, Grace?
You got it, yep.
Awesome. So, hey guys, so a couple questions for you, Grace. I'll start with the audience. First from Olga, is it harder to get a higher level job if you occupy a larger body?
Absolutely. So there have been some really interesting studies of executives and kind of this glass ceiling that people on upward trajectories toward the executive ranks hit because of their body size. We have this general thing in American culture, think leader, think male. And so when you think about what an ideal prototypical leader is, it's typically a white male. But there are other features of that white male. It's a slender white male. It's a modestly attractive white male. It's a non-ethnically ambiguous white male. So absolutely, it hinders career progression. Multiple studies have demonstrated that.
Okay. Second question from Greet, I think is how you pronounce it. In order to prevent this mistreatment at work, do you believe that if the Fair Employment Practices Law included body size and image, there would be less of this discrimination in the workplace?
So, great question. So I need to work with an economist because there's some pretty nifty natural experiments you can do, because there are some jurisdictions where discrimination against those in larger bodies is illegal, and you can be prosecuted for this form of discrimination. And what we see with some of these kind of discrimination laws that are not about size, but about, let's say, gender or race or et cetera, is that you can create a hostile work environment. So a hostile work environment around race, around gender. And so we would want those in larger bodies to also acknowledge that this kind of unfiltered commentary about people's body size is also creating a hostile work environment just around this new attribute. And so I would love to see increased legislation around that, because this is just not on people's awareness. My team and I have talked to HR professionals, and it's always, oh, I never thought of that. That's really interesting. It's just not on the same level as some of the other attributes that we protect.
Right. this is a question for me. Do you think that wellness programs encouraged by employers contribute to this weight-based discrimination? And kind of as a second part to that, what do we do about the inherent conflict in employers' perceived increased healthcare costs and the resulting discrimination based on health assumptions about fat colleagues?
Oh my gosh, I have no idea. I mean, I do. We've given this a lot of thought, but it's such a hard problem. So the first question is, so interestingly, our research has shown that if an HR sends out a lot of messages about kind of weight loss programs, like DePaul has like don't maintain, don't gain programs, which really puts a hyper focus on weight. Is that going to increase the rate or decrease the rate of weight-based mistreatment? And it seems to be neutral. It seems to have no association. But I think that certain workplaces, it's far more intense. So anecdotally, we've seen evidence of workplaces with like biggest loser challenges, so rapid weight loss challenges and prizes, and it creates this hyper awareness of weight that of course puts pressure on larger colleagues. And I'm sure there's social pressure on the part of larger colleagues to either participate or somehow justify their non-participation, which is just a little bit gross. Healthcare. So why do employers have to pay for healthcare is the larger question. But now that they do, what we would like to see, my research team, is that there is such a large body of evidence that says weight loss is not going to get you the health outcomes you think it is. And you've been sold a false bill of goods based on companies who want to make money off of you conforming to a size, assuming that it's going to get you health. And those two are just not associated. And so we would really love to, as kind of people in this space, start talking more and more to HR practitioners and to insurance companies about the lack of synchrony between health and weight. And you can be a perfectly healthy individual at any size. There's a movement called Health at Every Size, with a lot of advocates that look at the evidence-based research that health is possible at any size. So it's a fight. We'll get there.
Right. All right. From one of our anonymous attendees, what should managers do with the deluge of messages about the obesity crisis in the United States versus the need to not stigmatize it within the workplace?
I love that question. It's a great question because obviously there's no easy answer here. So what I think that a manager's role is, so if you're a manager and you are kind of coming between messages from the outside and your employees, you have to separate what's real and what's not. And so starting to educate yourself and kind of reprogram yourself around what are evidence-based understandings of how health and weight are in sync, and how might I communicate these to my employees. And so there's a lot of books out there by registered dietitians and doctors that I'm happy to share them. Anyone who emails me, I actually have a bibliography as part of my presentation to kind of get you up to speed on what that current health information is, but it's all about self-education. And so some of those kind of alarmist headlines, they become fake news because they are fake news. They're for clicks and they're for making the socially dominant group feel better. They're not for what actually is happening in people's bodies.
For Miranda, so is it fair to correlate racism and white supremacy with weight-based discrimination?
It's very hard to compare suffering, and we have to be very sensitive when we're comparing suffering. I mean, cannot ignore the Holocaust or slavery or lack of women's rights, and I certainly have no intention of doing so. I just want to put a little something else on your plate, just a little square, something else to think about. No, they're probably not equivalent because there haven't been mass genocide committed against people in larger bodies, but it does not take the pain and the suffering, the very real pain and suffering away from those in larger bodies right now. And so I think all I'm asking for is sensitivity, and I can advocate for weight-based mistreatment if you can advocate for racial equality, and we can both do our part to find more peace in this world.
I'll also add to that there's a lot of overlap, that a lot of the weight-based discrimination is based in racist ideas around usually Black bodies normally. So there is a lot of overlap there.
Can I add to that? Okay, add to that one more time. Yeah. Something I didn't get too much into is that this is also a class issue. So weight and class have historically always been intertwined. When you live in a society of plenty, it's better to be thin. When you live in a society without, it's better to be larger. And so over time, obviously, our society has had riches and non-riches. And so right now, the wealthier you are, there is more social pressure to be thin. And it's also a signal that you have more money. You can afford the trainer and the meal delivery and X, Y, and Z. And so we can't ignore class in this conversation either.
Definitely. Okay, Maggie says, did you see any difference in the amount of body shaming based on profession? Business, sales professions versus STEM professions or artistic professions?
It's a great question. So we did an analysis because we had so many different job types. There's, to get in the weeds here, ONET, the occupational network, they have different job classifications, and based on those classifications, they have typical work activities. So it gives you clues. Is this a white collar, blue collar, pink collar, what type of environment, and then what are some common activities? And the thing that really fell out, that jobs that have a physical component, that's where you see more mistreatment. And it's probably because, you know, if you and your colleague are both hauling boxes and you think your colleague is not doing their work because of their size, it falls on you and you have to do more. Maybe you perceive you're doing more than your fair share, and that can feel off. So we saw that. But we also saw that if we looked at those in our sample who are managers versus non-managers, the managers are getting more mistreatment. And we think, you know, managers, you're typically a little higher up in the professional ladder. And we think that's because of that violation of the prototype. You're not this typical leader if you're in a larger body. And so people are more likely to kind of be turned off by you and to denigrate you as a result. So there is some interesting stuff that we need to dig into there.
All right, I've got one more question here from Alex Brown. Is body size a protected class in employment in Illinois? If not, is it in any Illinois municipality?
It might be in Urbana, but I could be making that up. I know it's in Ann Arbor, and it's in a couple counties in California. It may be in Urbana, Illinois, but it's definitely not widespread. It's certainly not in Chicago, and it's not in the kind of northern Illinois region, unfortunately. If you want to join me in that fight, email me.
Someone has a comment. They said, there's also a lot of weight discrimination in religions and cultures. The Indian culture looks down upon bigger girls and women, especially in arranged marriages, as everyone prefers the skinny girls. They believe it defines their dignity and reputation. So there's probably a little bit of overlap around maybe religious discrimination at work in relationship to weight and all of the rest of it. Absolutely.
One of our next studies is intersectionality. It's something that we really haven't gotten into, like the experience of so I'll preview our results. So we really want to get into when somebody who's in African-American body versus a white body is mistreated at work. Both seem to want to retaliate, but the ways in which they retaliate are really quite different. And we suspect it's because those in African-American bodies have to control themselves a little more for fear of upsetting those around them and their actions being blown out of proportion. And so we're really interested in how that kind of plays out at a large scale. So that's our next data collection, is this intersection when it comes to retaliating against mistreatment.
Are there cultural differences? For example, is there less weight discrimination in China or Egypt than in the United States?
It's like a virus that's spreading. So wherever you see Western culture, there goes weight-based mistreatment and discrimination. So they've documented that quite a bit. So it's everywhere. It'll be everywhere. The more connected we are, good ideas spread, so do bad ideas.
Right. Let's see. I'm looking for, there's a couple more questions. One might think that weight discrimination would go down since people can now work remotely. Have you seen any evidence of that?
No, but my colleague Jacqueline, who worked on this with me, that was like the first thing she emailed me when we went work from home was how can we investigate how this is changing now that people are only seeing these smaller snapshots. That said, we also found a huge uptick in those news stories you talked about, where they're associating COVID is ravaging people who are in these, I'm putting quotes around it because I have issues around language, these obese bodies, when that's not actually the associated, it's correlational, number one, and weak association, number two, and there's bigger, more high quality studies that show that's not actually true. So are people in larger bodies? Yeah, you can't see me, but the level of shaming in popular media right now because of this alleged COVID weight link is pretty unrelenting. So I'm not sure that life has gotten that much better.
And then I guess I will qualify this as the last one, and so then we can move on to Joe. How exactly are you defining body image in your research? Is it how others perceive the body, or how the person themselves perceives their own body?
Both. So, you know, body image is giver and receiver. So I'm defining it as both. And so hopefully in this research, we're trying to capture both angles, both somebody who is mistreated and doing the mistreatment as well. It's important to have that reflective to see if there's alignment or non-alignment, and how non-alignment can cause even greater issues.
Okay. And then Joe, our other panelist had a comment, so I wanted to make sure everyone could hear or see that. He said that Anna Kirkland has some great work on the fat acceptance movement from a law and society perspective, if anyone is interested in how the socio-legal scholars have tackled some of these arguments. So if anyone is interested. Daryl, do we have a minute or two, or should we, because I do have one more question that just came in. You're on mute.
Sorry, yes, I think we have maybe one more minute.
Okay.
So let's make
All
this
right. Well, then this definitely will. All right. Did perpetrators you surveyed give any indication of feeling shame for their treatment of others, or did they feel that their treatment was warranted?
Warranted. Almost unequivocally warranted. It was not like, I feel bad about this and I want to confess to you, researcher. It's like, I feel bad about this, do something about it. We were very careful in our survey not to signal that we were on the side of the victim. We were trying to be as neutral as possible. We just want to hear about this. You know, we want to hear about your expression at work. We find this very curious. And so, yeah, no shame, no guilt, no nothing.
That's interesting. All right. Well, thank you so much, Grace. We really appreciate it. Yeah. So we'll give you what would be normally a round of applause in person. And we'll move on to Joe. Joe, you want to unmute yourself and then you can share your screen.
All right, here, let me just start by saying thank you to the Wicklander Institute for putting on this symposium and funding this research. I really appreciate the administrative team, especially Summer, who helped guide me through the grant process and answered all the really basic questions I had about how to access the funds over the summer. Also, thanks to Summer, Daryl, and Regina for their help in putting together this symposium and making sure everything runs smoothly, and to the Wicklander family for their generous donations, without which this research would not have been possible. This presentation explores the challenges facing activists looking to use cannabis legalization as a mechanism for repairing the damage done to communities of color during the war on drugs. I'm going to be sharing you some of the interview data that I collected during my time as a Wicklander Fellow. And I want to say at the outset that I've taken measures to protect the identity of my interview subjects as required by the IRB. So I'll be using pseudonyms for anyone that I quote here. And in some cases, I've omitted the name of the activist organization they belong to when such information might be identifying. But I am going to share their racial identity because that's relevant to the questions that we're going to be tackling in this presentation. The data that I'm sharing for this study was collected during the summer of 2019 through the winter of 2020. I conducted 43 in-depth interviews with cannabis activists and industry workers. They were all conducted over the phone. They were about 30 to 90 minutes in length. And we kind of talked about a wide range of issues, but in particular, important for this issue, we talked about race and neoliberalism or capitalism and how that has played out in the cannabis industry. All of my subjects self-identified as activists, and most were members of well-established activist organizations, such as the National Organization for the Reform of Marijuana Laws, NORML, the Drug Policy Alliance, Americans for Safe Access, or the Marijuana Policy Project. Additionally, 14 of my interviewees identified as cannabis industry workers, so they were either producers, processors, or retail operators. And 8 of my interviewees identified as non-white. And just as a last point of clarification, I'm going to use the word cannabis throughout this presentation, not what you more commonly hear, which is probably marijuana. That's a term that many people in the activist community find racially offensive. It was really introduced in this country as a way to demonize cannabis by associating it with Mexican immigrants. It's a colloquial Mexican word. So we're all going to use cannabis from here on out. All right, so this first slide I wanted to show you just looks at the use of cannabis by race. And unfortunately, both of these slides do not, the data doesn't differentiate on ethnicity. So when they say white, they're including Latinx people within that data. But basically the takeaway I want you to get from this is that there's no difference, right? That Black people, white people, Latinx people all use cannabis at roughly the same rates, right? And this information comes, by the way, from the Department of Health. But where we see differences are when it comes to arrests, right? And so this is the most recent data by the FBI Uniform Crime Lab reports. And what it's looking at is the arrest rate for possession of cannabis per 100,000 people. And what you can see roughly is that Black people are 4 times more likely to be arrested for cannabis possession than white people. And this number is probably much bigger if you take out Latinx people from the white population. And the other thing to note is that DC and Florida aren't included in this data, which also have large Black populations. So I'm sure these numbers would be even more stark if we included them. The reason I'm using possession data, by the way, is that 43% of all drug arrests in 2018 were for cannabis, which is by far the largest of any category. And 90%, almost 90% of those were for possession. So these are real small offenses, but people are put in handcuffs and taken to jail for them. And even in states that have legalized cannabis, we see a drop in the arrest rate, but we don't see a drop in the disparity. So Black people are still 4 times more likely to be arrested in, say, Washington or Illinois or whatever, but the amount of people who are arrested for possession has gone down. Now, the other important part of this puzzle here is that our attitudes towards cannabis are changing, right? So as you can see, public opinion has dramatically shifted in favor of cannabis, and a number of states have legalized cannabis, not only for medical use, but also for adult use as well. And this has created a large cannabis industry. So in 2019, the cannabis industry generated an estimated $12.4 billion in profits and about $1.9 billion in tax revenue. And by 2025, we're guessing that number is going to be $33.9 billion. So we're talking about a large amount of money that's being generated on cannabis sales. And it's only going to get bigger, right? In a few days, Arizona, New Jersey, South Dakota, and Montana are all going to vote on ballot measures which potentially could legalize cannabis in those states as well. New York is currently talking in their legislature about legalizing cannabis. So imagine this pool is going to get bigger and bigger. Which leads to the research question that really situates this presentation, which is, can we use this money, right, the resources this industry is generating to repair some of the damage caused by the war on drugs? And that's really the focus of the interview data that I want to present today. The first quote that I have here is from an activist named Henry Perez, and I include it for a couple of reasons. One, I think it's just a really nice summary of some of the problems that we see on this issue. And I think the point that he's making that I think is really important to note is the question isn't should we legalize cannabis, because clearly we are legalizing cannabis. The question is, how do we go about legalizing cannabis, right? And what are the more ethical ways to do this or not? And I think that's a really important question, and one that we often lose sight of when we talk about these issues. I also put it here to remind myself not to get too in the weeds on the details of cannabis reform, because if we do, this presentation is going to take 40 minutes. So if you have questions about the specifics of how to structure these industries, I'd love to take them in the Q&A, but I'm going to try to keep it to the basics as we work through this presentation. So the first story I want to share with you is the story of an activist by the name of Brian Gregory. Brian's a Latinx student activist, actually, with Students for Sensible Drug Policy. And he has a really interesting story. He's originally from Miami. His father was actually incarcerated for a drug offense. Throughout his life growing up, if he went to go see his father, he had to go to prison to see his father. And as a young child, he got into trouble with the law and had a few offenses. He didn't go into detail. At least some of them were cannabis related. Some of them were probably some other things he said. But he, was able to correct himself, and he actually in Florida, under their medical cannabis industry, had developed a cannabis business where he was selling edible cannabis products. And when he moved up to Massachusetts to go to college, he thought he would continue working in the cannabis industry. And what he found was, even though cannabis was legal in Massachusetts at the time, he was blocked from doing that because he had past criminal records of cannabis offenses. And so I think the quote does a really nice, interesting job of kind of summarizing that. But what's interesting is that technically speaking, Brian Gregory would probably qualify for something called expungement of criminal records in Massachusetts, right? Most states that have legalized cannabis have put in place some kind of procedure where you can have a past cannabis offense expunged from your criminal record. The problem is that the barriers to doing that are pretty steep. You have to petition to do it. It's a complicated process. It often involves hiring a lawyer. It often involves a lot of time. You have to know that you're eligible, which a lot of people don't, right? And so what we find is that only 3 to 6% of people who are eligible for expungement actually take advantage of that possibility. And so in a lot of states that have legalized cannabis, we're now allowing people to do something that in the past they couldn't do, but the people who have past offenses are still barred from participating in those industries. And as I showed earlier, if the arrest rates are higher for communities of color, this is disproportionately going to impact those groups. The second quote I have here is from a Black cannabis activist named Guy Butler, and Guy Butler operates a small activist organization focused on helping Black people, but also Latinx people get into the cannabis industry. And if anybody was going to be really happy about legalization, you would have thought it would be Guy Butler. So when I asked him what he thought about it, and he responded with this, right? I was really kind of taken aback. And the more I talked to people in this area, the more I found similar stories and similar perspectives to Guy, right? Which is a lot of people who've been fighting for decades for cannabis reform have actually been very disappointed with the way that it has gone about, and have felt in a lot of ways like they were better off in either a gray market or a black market prior to legalization. So for context here, only about 4% of cannabis businesses are owned by Black people. And so part of what Guy's talking about with this quote is lamenting the fact that so few people have been able to get involved in this industry. Now, there are a lot of reasons for why that might be, but I think a few of them worth talking about are around licensing, right? So if you want to operate a cannabis business, you have to get a business license to operate that business, much the same way if you were going to open a bar or a restaurant or something like that. But the process for getting those licenses can be very difficult, right? A lot of places, the licensing fees are really expensive. And in most places, they've been tight. The number of licenses that have been handed out have been tightly controlled. In Illinois, for example, local city and counties are able to determine whether or not they want to offer licenses and how many, and many of them have decided not to do so. And so what you have is a very small pool of licenses that are available to people, and a sort of lottery where you might or might not be able to get one. And that is problematic particularly for people of color, because paying those fees and navigating that process is something that they're not as well positioned to do as white people might be. There also are restrictions often for people who have past cannabis offenses. So if you've been convicted of a cannabis offense, oftentimes you can't get a license to operate a dispensary or a farm or something in a state. Now, a lot of times there are provisions where you can appeal or get around that process, but like we see with expungement, most people don't actually succeed or even attempt to go through that process. Another big problem that we have for communities of color is access to capital. Most people that you talk to in the industry will tell you right away that one of the biggest problems they're facing is that since cannabis is illegal at the federal level, banks won't give traditional business loans to people who are looking to open cannabis businesses. And so I've talked to people who, they take out a second mortgage on their house. I had one lady who said, yeah, I told the bank that I was buying a BMW and I got my credit card lifted up to $50,000 and I used that as a small loan to get the business started. People kind of had to find creative and sometimes risky ways to raise the capital to get involved here. And obviously, since we know that racial inequality is highly correlated with class, we find that white people have much more access to capital than people of color. And so that's another barrier that keeps people from being able to get into this industry and be successful. The next slide I wanted to share with you is a story by someone named Jennifer Gray. And Jennifer had a really interesting story because prior to legalization in Washington, she was a medical cannabis provider. And it was really interesting to hear a lot of her perspective because I learned a lot about the way medical cannabis is used. And what you often find is that medical cannabis strains tend to be the ones that can be really effective for curing some of these diseases and things, tend to be really low in the sort of THC and some of the psychotropic qualities that people look for to use cannabis recreationally. And they also tend to be low yielders, so plants that don't produce a lot of cannabis. And so the industry typically doesn't want to grow the kinds of strains that are going to be effective for medical patients. And so Jennifer, who, saw this as sort of an opportunity, right? Because, here she had all this experience growing these really sophisticated medical cannabis strains. And when things were legalized, she really wanted to get into that legal market and use that expertise to sell legally, right, to medical cannabis patients. And what she found was that it was very difficult to make the numbers match. And so she's talking here about a tier 1 license in Washington state. Tier 1 license is kind of like a micro brewery model. Like it's a really small license. And she basically ran the numbers for a tier 1 license and found that no matter what you did, you could never make that business profitable, right? Cannabis is a pretty cheap product to grow and actually to sell too, at least in bulk at the agricultural level. So you really have to do a lot of business, a lot of volume to make money, to make profit. And most of the people I talked to said, the only people who are making money on cannabis right now is the government, right? Most of the people in the industry are suffering. And so Jennifer, here's somebody who wants to transition to the legal market, who has a lot of expertise and yet can't do it, right? Because the business sort of numbers don't work for her, right? And I think what this highlights is that there are a lot of people who haven't transitioned to the legal market in states like Washington or California. And there's often a lot of scorn on those people. Why won't they move to the legal market? What's wrong with them? Why do they want to keep selling cannabis illegally? And I think what Jennifer's story shows is that it's not a want issue a lot of times. It's that they can't actually make that move, even if they wanted to, without some more assistance. The other thing that I find really interesting about her quote is that she does this really nice job of explaining all the business sort of steps she took. She made a business plan. She looked at the profits. She looked at the numbers, and it didn't work. And then at the end, she says, but hey, I'm not a good business person, so I don't know how to promote what I had. And what I think is interesting about that is that even though, she clearly identifies that there are structural issues that are preventing her from being successful, she internalizes these failures as her own failures. And I think this is something that we see when we move to a very capitalistic, neoliberal sort of retail cannabis market, is that it tends to focus on the individual. And so what we do is we have people succeed or fail, not based on their individual abilities, but maybe based on these structural problems that exist within the industry. But instead of identifying those failures as problems of racism or structural inequality or whatever they might be, we identify them as personal failings. And so that allows us to demonize people who failed, right? Particularly people of color. And you heard a lot of people would talk to me and they would say, well, people who sell cannabis out of the back of their trunk, they don't know how to run a business, right? And maybe that's true, but maybe that's also not true. And a lot of these failures aren't about a lack of business expertise, but about other problems. So we stigmatize those people, but also they internalize the stigma, right? And they think I'm failing, not the system's failing me. And so there's all kinds of problematic things I think that come out of that. Okay. So moving forward then, how do we address some of these issues, right? And many of the people I talk to are activists who are working hard. We're working hard to legalize cannabis, but after cannabis has been legalized, are continuing to work hard to try to reform cannabis laws to make them work more effectively. And so here's a quote from Sarah Evans, who was one of my more colorful interviewees. I really enjoyed her, and she's got some colorful language there, so I apologize if that offends anyone, but that's how she talks. But I think what she was getting at here, and I heard a lot of people talk about this, within the activist community, there's this big debate about, should we let the perfect be the enemy of the good when it comes to cannabis legalization, right? Do we accept legalization bills that are gonna result in legal cannabis, but maybe have deep flaws or problematic parts that we don't, as a community, really support, right? Are we going to support those because in the long run, we want legal cannabis? Or are we going to hold out for a bill that actually does the things we want, right? And a lot of people said, you know, we can't let the perfect be the enemy of the good. We can reform this later. And I think that is the common sort of approach. But I thought that Evans had a really interesting perspective, and particularly coming as somebody who's a person of color, you know, the historical experience is that you don't get very many opportunities to make change like this, right? And when they come around, you really have to nail it, because if you don't, you're going to be stuck with the broken system that you build, right? And so, you know, she makes this comparison to Jim Crow, to some of these other issues, right? And says, you know, we really can't afford to get this wrong, right? We have to solve these problems now. And I thought that was a really interesting counterpoint to the whole let's not let the perfect be the enemy of the good argument that you so often heard. Couple more slides and then I'm done. Catherine Torres is a cannabis farmer that I interviewed and an activist in Washington. And what you find is that most people who were in the cannabis industry were also activists, because you have to navigate these sort of Byzantine rules and procedures, and doing so is really difficult, and it forces you to kind of engage in activism as part of that process. And Torres comes from, as most of my interviewees comes from a social justice perspective, right? So her approach is really based on grassroots mobilizing of volunteer activists who are going to participate in these campaigns. And what she found, and what many of my people found, is that that's really effective as a one-time thing, right? You get one shot to mobilize grassroots activists and push for social change. But once you've taken that shot, right, you don't necessarily have the ability to keep remobilizing people, right? And so what happens is all these social justice people succeed in legalizing cannabis. Well, then most of them go home, right? And what you're left with are the industry lobbyists. And those people are coming from a more traditional business perspective, and they're paid, and they're not gonna, you know, go home after this is over. And so what you've seen is a shift in the activist organizations that are in DC and in some of the capitals of states that have legalized cannabis, away from a more social justice oriented approach of people like associated with NORML and some of these other organizations, towards a more business friendly approach. And I think that has been a really problematic issue for activists who thought, hey, let's pass this now and fix it later. All right, so I think I'm out of time, so I'll stop there.
You didn't have to stop so abruptly. You had a minute or two, but sure. So we have a couple questions, but I want to encourage the audience, if you have questions, feel free to put them in the chat or into the Q&A. So let me scroll up here a little bit. How many Black cannabis businesses are there in Chicago? Do you happen to know?
I don't know that number off the top of my head, but I do know that most of the licenses that were initially given out were given to existing, so the medical cannabis industry people, and almost exclusively those were white owned. And there've been, most of the activists I talked to pointed to Illinois' bill as like the best we've done on these issues. But the jury's still out as to how that's going to be implemented and enforced. And I think so far the early numbers are a little disappointing, but certainly Illinois got it better than I think any other state.
Okay. Are white-related sectors of the economy receiving more cannabis tax revenues than other sectors that serve people of color?
So that's a really interesting question as far as what these states do with the cannabis tax revenue, right? And it really varies by state, and it's really kind of determined by them. And actually at Illinois, it's also city and county level. And so there are some areas like Evanston, for example, that have some really interesting proposals on the table. Evanston is pushed to use their cannabis tax dollars to actually do reparations for the war on drugs and to give money. It's not clear how that's going to be done, but it might be to go to schooling, it might be direct checks, whatever it might be. And that is a really interesting proposal. I would say mostly, though, they're going to the general fund and they're covering, you know, pensions or whatever normal government expenses you would have, like in Illinois or anywhere else.
Right. Well, I think that answers your question, Patrick, because he literally just asked, how is it going to repair certain communities that have been affected by the war on drugs? Maggie, for those interviewed that were disappointed in the way that cannabis has been legalized, how would they have liked to see it done?
So great question, right? And there are a lot of different approaches, and it depends on who you talk to. I mean, you will talk to some people who are very radical, sort of anti-capitalist people who really don't think it should be legalized at all. Maybe decriminalize it and allow it to be sold, you know, individually, or even using a barter system, or let you grow your own cannabis in your backyard. But they don't like the idea of a retail market at all. And that's probably like the most extreme. And then there are various shades of how to legalize it in a way that is more beneficial. But a lot of people have argued, you know, we need some programs designed to help people of color who want to get into this industry overcome some of the structural hurdles, right? So there are these incubator proposals where you have to, if you want to get a license as a white person, you have to have a person of color as part of your business license, right? So Massachusetts did that, California did that. But what we find is that oftentimes those partners fall off after a while, and they're really just there to get the license. So in terms of meaningful constructions, I think it's really hard. A lot of activists have told me, and I think this is true, you know, cannabis is a really unforgiving business industry right now, right? It is very difficult to make a profit. And a lot of them said point blank, we don't think people of color should be trying to get into this industry. We're just setting them up for failure. What we should do is take the money from it and distribute it to these communities in other ways, right? Help them get microloans to open businesses that aren't cannabis related, or fund education, or whatever it might be, as a mechanism for getting around some of these issues. So there's lots of stuff there. The other thing I think a lot of people argue is that we shouldn't have these licensing restrictions, because what the licensing restrictions do is make it really difficult. They're this barrier to entry, make it really difficult for people to get involved. The other debate is about vertical versus horizontal integration. And frankly, I don't know which is better, because some states have refused to allow vertical integration. Some states mandate vertical integration. And I'm not sure, I mean, there are good arguments for the benefits to communities of color for both of them. I'm not sure which is better. But those are a few ideas that people have debated about.
Great. Considering the growing cannabis industry and the legalization of cannabis, do you think other psychedelics like LSD and mushrooms are on track to legalization as well?
So Oregon has a ballot measure this year to legalize psilocybin, which is the active ingredient in mushrooms, psychedelic mushrooms. I don't really know if that's where we're going or not, or I haven't seen any polling data on whether that would pass. It's an interesting question coming from a libertarian perspective about whether we should regulate these things or not. I think cannabis is in a little bit of a unique situation, just given that it's so widely used, and it had such a powerful medical cannabis movement that predates the legal cannabis movement that I think really is responsible for a lot of the shift in public opinion. And there is some information, there's some data to suggest that psilocybin could be used medicinally, but there certainly isn't a movement around it the way medical cannabis had a movement. So I think I'd be putting the cart before the horse a little bit at this point.
Right. Is crime overall decreasing in or increasing in states where cannabis has been legalized?
So great question, right? I mean, one of the things that, there's sort of this NIMBY effect, right, around cannabis, the cannabis industry. People worry that if you build a dispensary in a neighborhood, crime's going to go up around the area. We haven't seen any data to suggest that that's true at all. It doesn't seem like it has any effect. If anything, yeah, crime has gone down because we're no longer arresting people for cannabis offenses. But I think even then it's pretty marginal. So because a lot of these states are still arresting people for cannabis offenses, they're just arrested for selling cannabis on the black market or whatever it is, instead of doing it through legal means.
Right. Since more states are legalizing cannabis, do you believe that at some point in the future, the federal government will legalize cannabis as well? And do you think the startup costs will rise or fall?
So I think that the federal government will will legalize it in the sense that I think they will eventually remove Schedule 1 classification for cannabis, which will allow states to legally, really legally do what they're doing. Because actually, technically, they're still violating federal law in Illinois by having the cannabis industry. I do believe that will happen. The lobby is pretty strong. And it's actually because, and a lot of this is other chapters of the book, but because they've framed this around profit and these sort of capitalist principles, a lot of Republicans actually support legalizing cannabis. In fact, John Boehner, who was former Republican Speaker of the House, is now a lobbyist for the cannabis industry in DC. So I think it's inevitable that we will. That doesn't mean that every state is going to have legal cannabis, though. I think it's going to be up to the states to legalize it afterwards. But all we're going to do is say federally, we're going to kind of decriminalize it. I think that'll probably be the route it will take.
Okay. Hannah's asking, do you believe the legalization of weed is still inherently anti-Black, as those Black, Indigenous, people of color who have served time are still looked down upon?
So do I think that legalizing cannabis is anti-Black? No, I don't think that legalizing cannabis is anti-Black. I think most of the activists I talk to would tell you the reason they're involved in cannabis activism is because of the war on drugs and the disproportionate impact it had on communities of color. That, or they're here for medical patients and healthcare, right? So I don't think the goal is in any way racist. I think the problem is that the industry has a different set of priorities, and their priority is to make money, and those priorities don't align. And I think that a lot of people in the activist community have made a bit of a kind of a bad bargain with the industry, right? Where they've traded away some of the issues that they're near and dear to them on issues of racial justice, and for example, for legalization. And so you have some bills that are really problematic in Washington, California, to a lesser extent, Colorado. And a lot of that's baked in, and it's been very difficult to undo some of that damage. So it's really, it was heartening to watch this happen in Illinois in real time, and to see the debate be a little bit different in a state that I think has a much larger Black community, a much more engaged community. Especially Chicago NORML was really big on pushing racial equity arguments. And there is some evidence to suggest, I think, from the research, that the activist community learned a lesson from Colorado and some of these other states and has prioritized racial equity more. So we'll see.
Okay. It's kind of in a continuation of that federal question that you kind of just answered, but do you think if it was legalized or decriminalized at the federal level, that it would make it easier for people of color to obtain cannabis business licenses? Would that make any difference at the state level?
Yes, because I think they would have an easier time getting capital, right? Raising capital. So that would be helpful in that regard, because they could get traditional business bank loans then. But I don't think it would make that big of a difference, because it's still hard for people of color to get a bank loan, a regular bank loan. If you look at just net worth by race, you'll find disproportionately Black people, even middle-class Black people, have much lower net worth than similarly situated white people. And so I think that is always going to be a persistent problem for getting them into that industry, unless we do something that targets specifically overcoming those hurdles.
This is kind of a continuation of the federal question. In terms of legalization, why does the federal government generally take a backseat to the states? Why do they kind of look the other way in terms of enforcement right now?
So in terms of enforcement, the Cole memo, which was introduced during the Obama administration, basically the DOJ said, as long as the state is regulating cannabis, right, and has state laws that are regulating this industry, we're not going to get involved if people are following those state regulations. And that was a shift, because what you initially had with medical cannabis was essentially an unregulated free-for-all, right, where states legalized medical cannabis through the ballot measure process, but never articulated a regulatory system for how they were going to, oversee that, right? And what's interesting is people in the medical cannabis industry actually asked to be regulated, because they didn't want federal prosecution anymore. And they thought, hey, if we say, look, we're going to pay taxes, you can come in, you can inspect my farm, you can see all my plants, you can see that I'm doing everything above board, then I'm not going to get prosecuted. And that gamble, I think, did work. It took time to get there, but it did work. And so the federal government has largely allowed, as long as states are clearly regulating, and Colorado was one of the first to sort of do that, and then California and sort of spread. And now pretty much every medical state has a well-regulated medical cannabis economy. The federal government has decided to take a back seat to that. Now, there was some noise about whether Jeff Sessions was going to go back on that early in the Trump administration. And, it ultimately didn't amount to anything. And, like I said, at this point, it's sort of a bipartisan issue. So I don't foresee the federal government changing its perspective on that anytime soon.
Right. Do you think the cannabis industry will contribute to globalization or an increased dominance, I guess, for the United States in globalization?
Yeah, it's a great question, right? Are we going to take over the rest of the world with cannabis? I don't know the answer to that question, but we seem to dominate everything else. So I wouldn't be surprised if our economic sector does that as well. I mean, California, the Emerald Triangle, produces more cannabis than any other region in the world. I think it's pretty safe to say, right? At least more what we call like high quality cannabis that's desirable for the retail market. So my guess is that with legalization, that's only going to go up. And of course, some of that potentially could be exported if other countries legalize cannabis as well. Right now, though, you cannot sell cannabis across state lines, let alone across international lines. So globalization isn't really something to worry about yet. If there is a globalization threat, it's actually coming from Canada, because a lot of Canadian companies are coming into the US and investing and taking over our industry.
Right. Okay. So my question actually is, in Illinois, it was my understanding that the expungement process was part of the legislation that they drafted, that it was going to be automatic and not necessarily something you had to go pursue.
Yeah.
Is that true? Has that actually happened that way? And maybe you can give just a quick explanation of what you mean by expungement.
So great question, right? So expungement basically means if I had a past cannabis offense, under certain circumstances, I can have that offense wiped from my criminal record, so that when I go to apply for a job, they no longer know that I was convicted of a cannabis offense in the past, right? So most states that legalize cannabis allow, at least for misdemeanors, right, for you to have your record expunged. Some states, even some felonies are allowed. But most cases, you have to petition to have that happen. Now, California is doing something really interesting. And I actually talked to some people who are working on this program. It's a nonprofit organization called Code for America, and they have a project called Clear My Record. And they're basically computer programmers who are activists. And they piloted this program in California where they wrote code that would automatically expunge anyone who was qualified, who met certain requirements that they negotiated with the Attorney General in California, would automatically expunge their records without them having to petition. And they cleared 75,000 records automatically, just in 3 counties. And then California passed a law which said they had to expand that to the entire state. So they're working on that right now. And it's just a matter of getting the data and making it work, because there's a lot of imperfections in the data and that kind of stuff. And then thinking about the way different localities' laws work. Now, the Cook County wants to do the same thing, and they are in talks with building a program that will also do that in Illinois. It's my understanding that they haven't gotten that off the ground yet, but that is the next phase of where they're going. So that's another way in which I think the Illinois law is in some ways a model law for how to do this right.
That's great. Let's see. You mentioned that there was false information that was being fed to Black entrepreneurs in this process. What was some of that false information?
So my interviewee's quote, yeah, his whole thing was, look, if you look at the media coverage of cannabis, you get this impression that it's this green rush, right? That there's all this money to be made, and this is going to be this huge economic opportunity for these communities. And a lot of people got really excited that, this was going to be a huge economic boom. And that ended up being not true, right? Even for people who could get into the industry, most of them are not making money right now. And the ones who are tend to be these really big chains like MedMen and Moda and Rise and some of these sort of chains, which are the ones that are mostly in Illinois, by the way. So they were sort of promised this economic opportunity that didn't materialize. And I think that's a lot of the sort of the frustration that you see from people like Guy.
Okay. Sorry, I'm just going through some old questions here. There is some evidence, especially out of Australia, that heavy cannabis use is correlated with some psychological health issues. Are there ethical issues associated with the fact that white patients may be able to get treatment while others will not? And has there been any sort of incorporation of that into the laws?
So the last part, I'm not quite, I don't know if I quite follow. The treatment for cannabis abuse, is that what you're saying?
Right.
So I think that's a really interesting question. And something that maybe doesn't get talked about enough is that once we move this debate away from shouldn't we legalize cannabis, we can start focusing on some of the issues within the cannabis community that are more nuanced, right? And I think one of them is abuse, right? That it's definitely true, right? Just like alcohol or any other drug, people can abuse cannabis, right? But we don't necessarily talk about that so much, and we don't have treatment programs so much. And in fact, I think, and I talked to a psychiatrist actually, who is also a cannabis farmer, and he was saying, I think there's a lot of overcompensation within the cannabis community. People will tell you it's this medical panacea and it has no harmful effects and blah, blah, blah. And to some extent, it's true. There is no lethal dose that we found for cannabis, which is weird because there's a lethal dose for water, okay? So it's safer than a lot of substances in that regard. But absolutely, it can have some really negative psychological effects, particularly for people who have schizophrenia or underlying medical illnesses. And it can be abused just like any other drug. And so his whole thing was, I want to move this conversation where we can talk about what reasonable cannabis use looks like, and we could help people who are maybe, abusing it. And I think that extends across all racial lines, to be honest.
Okay. One more question from the audience here. Drug cartels are heavy into cannabis. Will legalization decrease their profits, and will that cause any sort of repercussions criminally or violence-wise, societally?
Sure. So I think the jury's still out on how that's going to play out. You're still seeing a lot of cannabis coming in from the cartels. Look at Illinois and some of these other states, the prices for the legal cannabis market are really high. So people are still buying illicit cannabis on the illicit market. Over time, that's probably going to dry up, right? My guess would be. I'm not an expert on drug policy, but my sort of gut says that the cartels are going to switch to something else, that a lot of the heroin epidemic that we're starting to see a resurgence of in places like Portland, where I'm from, or Chicago, is probably a result of the cartels moving from cannabis to heroin. And to some extent, that's already been happening because a lot of the cannabis sold in the US is domestically grown in California and other places, and has been since at least the 80s. But yeah, I absolutely think that's something to think about, is how this will affect other drugs, for sure.
Anticipate the kind of ripple effect of all these changes.
Exactly.
All right, well, I think that's it. Thank you guys so much for a fantastic talk. This has been great. And thank you to our audience members for contributing such great questions. I'll hand it over to Daryl if she has any closing thoughts.
Yeah, I just wanted to thank both of our panelists and the audience for coming. I certainly learned a lot, and I could tell from the one-on-one chats I was receiving that our audience was very excited and engaged by both presentations. So thank you for all that work you did. I think the Wicklander family would be very happy with how their money was spent this year. I also wanted to mention that we will be having applications for next year's round of Wicklander fellowships opening in the spring. So watch for that. And just a final push to our undergrads who are in the audience, that there is a Pat Warehane scholarship that will be opening soon that the Institute for Business and Professional Ethics offers. If you're a business major with a philosophy minor or a philosophy major with a business minor, you're eligible for this scholarship, and I'd say go for it. It's another chance to study ethics at DePaul University with some great professors of the sort you saw in action here today. So this concludes this year's fall Wicklander event, and thank you very much. And send us a question at IBP if you have any questions about the program, or if you have any questions about the Institute's future activities. Thank you, and an applause for everybody.
Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.